In February 1637, a single flower bulb in Amsterdam was worth more than a canal house, and nobody involved thought that was insane until the exact moment it collapsed. This wasn't a scam or a con, it was ordinary Dutch citizens making a perfectly reasonable bet that got progressively less reasonable with every single passing week. It started with a virus, literally a mosaic virus that painted tulip petals with wild flame-like streaks, and suddenly plain flowers became one-of-a-kind collectibles. The Dutch Republic was also freshly rich, flush with Golden Age trading profits, and rich societies with spare cash have a very long history of finding something silly to gamble it on. A single Semper Augustus bulb, the rarest of the striped varieties, once sold for the price of a house on Amsterdam's finest canal, roof included. By 1636, ordinary tulip breeds were rising in price nearly every single week, and taverns turned into informal trading floors packed with hopeful buyers. Legend says one weaver traded his entire house for a single bulb. And whether every detail is exactly true, dozens of ordinary people genuinely staked their homes on flowers. Trading soon moved to paper futures contracts on bulbs still buried underground, meaning people were now buying and selling flowers that technically did not exist yet. This became known as Windhandel, literally wind trade, because money changed hands for a promise of a flower nobody could actually touch or see. Bakers, blacksmiths and chimney sweeps all started trading bulbs on the side because when your neighbour doubles his money in a week, caution starts feeling like the risky choice. Rumours of huge foreign demand from France and beyond kept pouring fuel on the fire, though nobody seemed to check whether that demand was actually real. Even common, unremarkable bulbs got swept up in the frenzy, selling for wild multiples of their worth purely because prices had only ever gone up. Then on February 3, 1637, at a routine bulb auction in Haarlem, the room simply refused to bid, and silence is the loudest signal a bubble can send. Within days, prices weren't just falling, they were free-falling, some bulb values dropping over 90% in barely a single week. Buyers who had signed contracts at peak prices simply refused to pay, and sellers holding worthless paper had absolutely no realistic way to force them. The bulb that once bought a house now couldn't reliably buy dinner, and the paper promising its value was worth exactly the ink it was printed with. Growers who had planned entire fortunes around a single rare flower watched that fortune wilt in their fields, along with the actual tulips. Regular Dutch trade in spices, textiles, and shipping barely noticed. The ships kept sailing, the docks kept working. This panic stayed strangely contained. Investors who'd bet everything on one glowing bulb were left holding contracts that Dutch courts would eventually rule were never truly enforceable at all. The weaver who traded his house for a flower was left with neither, just an ordinary tulip bulb worth roughly what any ordinary tulip bulb was worth. City authorities eventually stepped in and ruled the futures contracts were essentially gambling debts, letting buyers settle for a small fraction of the agreed price. The wider Dutch Golden Age barely stumbled. Shipping profits, art and trade kept climbing for decades after tulip prices returned quietly to earth. Most historians now agree the real economic damage was actually fairly small, concentrated among a limited circle of speculators rather than the whole nation. The wild myths about ruined merchants and a shattered Dutch economy mostly came later, from moralizing writers who loved a good cautionary tale. Tulip growing itself carried on completely fine. The flowers kept blooming, the trade kept going, just without the absurd speculative prices attached. Here's the twist nobody tells you. Tulip Mania wasn't really a national catastrophe. It was a small, contained bubble that outlived its own facts. What actually spread everywhere afterward wasn't financial ruin. It was the story becoming economics' favourite metaphor for irrational, self-feeding hype ever since. From the 1820s railway mania to the dot-com crash to more recent digital speculation, the tulip pattern just keeps getting a new coat of paint. The lesson was never really about flowers. It's that when an asset's price depends entirely on someone else paying more for it tomorrow, tomorrow eventually arrives. So the next time something seems obviously too valuable to fail, remember the bulb, the wind trade, and the empty room where nobody wanted to bid.